All right. Well, good. Well, I am very excited to be joined by the fabulous Dr. Z. You're going to have to pronounce, how do I actually pronounce your last name for me?
Oh my God. Oh, I don't think anybody ever asked me how to pronounce it, but it's Zahareva.
Zahareva. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Awesome. Well, good. Well, so I have been familiar with Dr. Z for many years. Of course, she's an expert in the field, and behind the scenes, she's been very supportive to me. As one of the wonderful things about working in this area is we get to work with other people in the field and support each other. But I'm really excited about, and what I really want to focus on today is your new book, which is absolutely a game changer.
Oh, I really appreciate that.
Yeah,
I
absolutely. So
love your book as well too. So not to be ego stroking, I genuinely do absolutely love your book Affirmed. It's a phenomenal surgical guide.
good, good. Our books are very different. We've got very different styles, but even as somebody personally, who isn't transgender, I got a lot out of it. There's just pearls and pearls of wisdom in there. So tell me, first of all, why did you write this book?
That's a good question. The conception of the book kind of just stated many years ago. I really did not want to write transgender one-on-one guide or how to figure out your identity. I really wanted first and foremost for people to feel as if I'm sitting across from them. So as if they're sitting across from somebody that is very specialized and that person is talking directly to them. And I also wanted it to have some of the things that will help people through their paradigms, because for majority of the individuals, the most difficult thing is to take that first step. No matter how small it is to take that first step, even to acknowledge to themselves that they're struggling with dysphoria. So I wanted it to be written in such a way where each chapter is focused and aimed at breaking down particular fear or concern or worry, and along the way to give people advice and guidance how to go through that.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what I think is so different about you. And one thing I've really appreciated about you is how you don't sit on the fence. The classic thing with mental health professionals is, if I ask a question, you're going to answer with a question. And the one thing that really struck me early on in any of our interactions is you just don't do that. I mean, sometimes there is a right answer. And that's what I love about this book. You kind of lift the lid on that. You don't kind of tiptoe around. Sometimes the advice is cutting and you need to hear it. But I think, to me, that is the huge value in the book. To talk to me a little bit about how the book is structured, because it's so easy to read.
Yeah, so I'm glad you also picked up on, and I have the book here too. I'm glad that you picked up um, on the fact that it's very direct. So you know me, people know me. My channel, the way I talk on my channel is very direct. I'm not a big fan of long-term talk therapies. There's a space and time for that. When it comes specifically for gender diverse individuals, I think that what's really helpful for people is to figure out what to do about it, because so much of feeling more congruent happens outside of therapy. It happens by actually going through the process of, for a lot of people, if it is hormones, for some people, if it is surgeries. And that's something that you can do in therapeutic capacity. So I'm very hands-on, and I don't shy away from giving advice. And I wanted the book to be that way. But to get back to how it's broken down, so it's broken down into 4 parts. The first part is very brief. It's basically giving a very brief but concise overview of dysphoria, why it shifts around through your body, why one day you may not have dysphoria and suddenly the next day you do, just to give people who may be very new to the concept and the topic, just to give them a general overview. And then I get right into that. And the second part is called Stop Telling Yourself This. And these are all type of things. And if you read my book, and I know you do have, each chapter is super short because I don't beat around the bush. I just go straight to this, right? So there's, for example, chapter, if I transition, I will be unattractive, which a lot of people tell themselves. They're so afraid that they will not be passable if passing matters for them. So I go straight for that. I talk about that. I talk about this tendency to hyper focus on passivity, but what about your health? What if the goal was your health versus passing? And passing was the goal, but secondary. So that's the second part of the book. And then I go, after I break down all this, oh my goodness, the spheres we go through, then consider this. Now I'm talking about little building blocks you can consider that will strengthen you along the way, that will give you all the things you need to become more confident, to become more assertive, steps you can take if you're in a relationship, how to navigate that. And the final part is called on your terms. And that's focused even more on empowering you, how to, for example, find your compass, right? How, for example, to live in the now, how not to die empty, which I love the chapter. And my sister who read it, she said, I at first I thought, die empty. What are you saying, die empty? I don't want to die empty. But the whole concept of the chapter is that everybody's dream is buried at the cemetery. So you don't want to die with your dream of being authentic self.
Yeah.
So that's how it's structured. It's kind of built up on itself, and it's meant to have, you can obviously pick it up and read anywhere, but it's built on momentum.
Yeah, I love that. And the last part of the book, like it really applies to everybody. And I find it's like those little individual chapters, I feel like they're Dr. Z-isms. I mean, I can hear you.
Love that.
I feel like it's something you've been telling patients over the years, and just really good, solid advice we could all benefit from. And, some of it not necessarily very mainstream. It's not like the same old stuff you read over and over again. So, to that effect, one thing that resonated, I mean, obviously I'm a surgeon, I specialize in this field, but we do, even in my field, I will hear common themes. And so I was wondering if we can maybe jump into some of those really tricky questions, really tricky situations patients find themselves in. And I chose two of the ones I think are the most trickiest, and just what, does Dr. Z say about these situations. So the one I've heard a lot before, and I couldn't start to answer this really, would be my partner won't let me transition. Like, what do you do in that circumstance?
I think I have a chapter titled exactly that. My partner won't let me transition. So I think one of the important things to realize is that when you're in a relationship, you obviously have to find the common ground and things to compromise on. If your partner is very strongly against you stepping into gender affirming care in form of transition, then at that point, I think it's important to reevaluate, right? What's on the table here and what you're bargaining with. People often feel that it's their partners that hold them hostage, but in reality, we create this codependency pockets within ourselves, and then we hold ourselves in really bondage versus our partners. So I think it's really important to realize at that point how much your health matters to you, because in my opinion, gender affirming care, whether it is medical or surgical, to me, this is not cosmetic. This is not a walk in the park. This is life-altering type of treatment that is necessary in order to alleviate dysphoria, in order to alleviate distress, so that people can actually live happy, joyful, productive, dysphoria-free life. So we're really talking about mental and physical health. We're not talking about, I want to go ahead and get neck lift on because I want to look younger. People are really suffering and struggling. And I think it's important to remind our patients that, look, it is your health on the line. And if your partner has a hard time seeing that, then perhaps couples therapy here in order to reevaluate what's happening here if your partner doesn't realize such an important life-saving component in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one thing I don't hear a lot in my practice, but again, oftentimes by the time patients come to surgical transition, it tends to be sometimes, because of the availability of services in this country, it can be years into their transition. So I don't tend to hear this a lot, but I imagine this is a tough one to answer. What if I end up detransitioning?
My answer when people say, what if I end up detransitioning, is, well, then you'll end up detransitioning. Life, we make choices in life, and sometimes those choices are really tough ones. When it comes to choices in regards to gender dysphoria, that's another tough choice, because for some people, they may figure more about their sense of identity as it actually goes through the process. It's the process that tends to kind of open up and broaden the sense of who they are. And that may happen after a person has a surgery, right? So I think what's most important is to be aware that that can happen. I see this happening very rarely with adults. With adult population, if that happened, usually people report to me, at least that some detransitions I talked to, it was more along the lines of, I noticed my gender identity has evolved beyond what I thought it was. So I think it's just important to be open to discuss it and to acknowledge that that's a possibility. And yeah, that can happen, and you'll cross the bridge when you get to it. And if that really scares you and terrifies you, then perhaps maybe surgery is not a good option for you at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And have you ever come across situations where somebody clearly is suffering from gender dysphoria, like the diagnosis isn't a question or the feelings aren't in question, and is it ever the right answer to just ignore it, just carry on?
No, it's never the right answer to ignore. I always tell people, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you if it's going to get worse or if it's going to suddenly, as you get older, a little subside. What I do know, and what I do have crystal ball on after 17 years in practice, is that it won't just vanish. Because, at least in my case, again, adults, they come and they have decades and decades of dysphoria. And they have done, you probably noticed, everything under the sun. They have tried to overcompensating with their biological gender assigned at birth, it's like everything, you name it. And nothing seemed to work. So my question is, well, if you've done all of this and you're still struggling with dysphoria, what makes you think more time is going to suddenly make it go away? So it's definitely not something that goes away. If anything, it tends to get more exasperated, especially now, because we live in a world where we're talking about gender issues. So if somebody's, for example, older and never had that Lexington, right now they have that vernacular to discuss. Now they can name what's happening to them. Once you can name your internal problem, your mind starts to yank in and look for solutions. Once the mind knows that solutions are out there, that creates tension between that's possible and where you're at right now. So that tension starts to push on dysphoria and make dysphoria worse and worse and worse psychologically. So I wish I could tell people it can just go away and vanish, but the reality is that I have yet to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. And have you noticed an influence? I feel like since I've been, in practice, like heavily doing this type of work, like over the past 10 years, it feels like things got maybe a little bit easier. There was more public awareness, there were more folks in the media. And then, of course, more recently, the pendulum seems to have swung the other way, where we see all this anti-trans legislation. Are you seeing that, getting into people's minds and affecting their decisions to come out?
Are influencers getting in the people's minds, affecting their decisions to come out?
Yeah, like just the recent, the legislation.
Either pressure, so either social contagion.
Yeah. Well, right. Well, that's another point, I guess. But what I mean, like, the recent political situations. I'm in Florida, so we hear about it a lot more, obviously down here. But so many states have anti-trans legislation, and I'm wondering, is that outside noise? Do you see that affecting patients directly in their decisions about coming out and safety to do so?
Yeah, 1000%. So I would say that the ways that the politics sadly are politicizing and using the gender affirming care, and people might say it sounds biased because of course you're in this field, but I really think it has nothing to do with people, kids or adults, or their well-being. Because if they really cared about them, in my opinion, they need to regulate providers. How experienced are we? How experienced am I, right? I think that's more important than completely banning stuff. So when there's such upheaval and such ban on care for anybody who's already struggling with dysphoria, it's going to create an internal sense of existential crisis, fear-based, that what's going to happen if the services are going to abruptly stop. Yeah. So in other words, now what they don't realize they're doing, they're making it worse for some people. They're rushing people that perhaps could benefit from exploring more, right?
Yeah.
So what we really need to do is we need to open up avenue for people to be open to explore as much as they can. We need to acknowledge that gender is a construct and it is completely socially constructed and does change throughout the history and time, and that it's totally fine and normal and natural to gender bend, right? Mm-hmm. instead of creating this sense of chaos and crisis for people. So I think what happens is for some people that truly have gender dysphoria, sometimes they just have to rush into services because they're so afraid they won't have them. And there's some people who may not even need the services, but get rushed into it by all this frenzy.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it makes sense. And so then moving on to, my favorite chapters, towards the end of the book, I was hoping you could explain some of the Dr. Z-isms, that are universally useful to everybody, in my opinion. So what does it mean when you say build houses, not castles?
Oh, that one, I got that one working with the client and explaining what was happening to the individual. And I thought this is great. And I loved it so much. So when people start off, they start off with little building blocks. And a lot of times, a lot of people, they will start building castle. The castle is a metaphor for starting to feminize or masculinize or present non-binary, or in other words, to externalize your true self. And that externalization is the castle. So you start building the castle, oftentimes in private, because you're cherishing and you're still feeling lack of confidence. And so you put all of this work into the castle. And sadly, what happens is when you're ready to present your castle, sadly, we live in a world where it takes one person that is mindless and clueless and just not very nice to give you a look or to say something or to even non-verbally communicate a sense of disapproval for you then to have your castle completely crashed. And when the castle crashes, a lot of people, they go into isolation. They say, I can't do this. This will never happen to me. It will never work. They lose all of their hope and belief. So when I say build instead of one big castle, start building little houses. What is a little houses? Little houses are, today my little house is, I'm going to share my pronouns with my close friend. Tomorrow, my little next house is going to be, I'm going to present more advantageously. The after tomorrow is going to be, I'm going to come out at work. The more little houses you build, you end up creating a whole village. And if somebody crushes one of your houses, in the end, you still have the entire village. And that's very powerful.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I have another one. What do you mean by collect your own stars?
That comes from, I don't know where you're from.
I'm from Ireland originally, Ireland. Yeah.
So do they give little golden stars?
Yeah.
They do, right? So in Russia, they do the same thing. So you get this little stars in America too. When you do really well, they give you golden stickers for your behaviors. So it comes from that. A lot of times when people start on their gender exploration, they feel like they need those stars in the form of validation from others. They crave to receive those stars from everybody else. They crave to have the world reflect back to them how they see themselves. And it's important, and we're social beings. We all crave validation, but it's first and foremost essential to learn how to give those stars yourself and learn how to have a whole drawer of those stars of sense of self-value and self-worth. So anytime you're down, you have a drawer you can open up and you can give yourself a golden star.
Yeah. And like how would you practically do that? Just self-talk, or
you can do self-talk, but it's really starts with what I notice a lot with people who struggle with dysphoria, because they've been struggling for so many years. They sense of self starts to feel very broken. Like, I'm defective, I'm broken, I mean, my goodness, the amount of self-loathing people have is so painful to watch. There's lots of shame and guilt. And that starts to overshadow other aspects of personality, of character, of your traits. And the people that I work with are, and you too, they're incredible people. You and I know them. They are fantastic people. They're brilliant, they're super creative, they're incredibly successful human beings. And they tend to dismiss all these other areas where they're so valuable and they're so amazing, because this one tends to overshadow. So it's first and foremost to start to recognize that, okay, this part I'm still working on, but I'm a wonderful parent. I'm a wonderful partner. I'm a wonderful coworker. I do this and this and this at my work, and that's how I benefit society. I'm a wonderful human being. And remembering those essences about you, because that's your values. Those are your golden stars.
Yeah. I have another one. What do you mean by don't annihilate your inner ruler?
That's probably going to sound very complicated to anybody listening. Don't annihilate your inner ruler is a concept when people start going through gender transition, whatever transition might be for them. I always tell them, envision inside of your head space, it's your kingdom. And up to this point, the person who ruled that kingdom was you, embodying your gender assigned at birth, and all of the interaction and everything was based on that. And you basically created this landscape based on of that. When you start to get more self-aware and in touch with your authentic self, a lot of people just want to completely annihilate their old self, right? Like they prefer dead naming, which if it works for you, that's fine. Some other things, but they don't want anything to do with their old self. And I always say, your old self got you to this point. Your old self probably sustained you, helped you deal with dysphoria, help you cope during the most difficult times, probably got the job you have right now to have resources to go through everything you're going through. So the goal is, instead of annihilating, why don't we put this ruler aside, because they have done ruling over the kingdom. Why don't we go ahead and put the new ruler on a pedestal? And instead of completely demolishing the landscape, what are you going to keep? But what are you going to let go? Because there's so many things about you that are still going to be the same and relevant to you. So that's what it's about, integration. So this is a chapter about integrating past is present versus completely splitting and cutting off.
Yeah, I love that. And what would you say, like, to try and distill down for somebody who feels like, let's say they're early in their transition, or they're just having these feelings, what would be your, let's say, top 3 tips if you had to distill down like the best doctor's advice if you're early on with maybe feelings of dysphoria?
If you're early on, I'm trying to brainstorm because my mind suddenly went, are they terrified and scared to make first steps, or they want to take first steps and they don't know? Any advice I always give to anybody, regardless where they're at, is baby steps. I have actually a video coming up that I recorded called Why Baby Steps Are the Holy Grail of Gender Transition. Because yes, you can run as a speed rain, but baby steps toward anything, even if your baby step today is wake up and make an appointment with a doctor to get information, or maybe for somebody else the baby step is I woke up and I was able to cope with dysphoria. Whatever your baby step is, the more baby steps you have toward your biggest goal, the more you're building up little building blocks toward your foundation of your future self. And it's compounding interest, right? And we all know compounding interest works. So my advice would be, it may feel right now like nothing is working and like nothing is ever going to happen, but those baby steps, they add up to mountains.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that definitely, same thing applies to surgical patients. Like, I love when I hear a patient, they'll reach out and they're like, well, I'm not quite ready, surgery's in my future, but, I'm gathering information. They're looking at the resources, they're preparing everything, because some of these surgeries, can be very overwhelming. And it's, the last thing you want to do is rush into them. If you take vaginoplasty, for example, if you're not at a point in your life where you can do the maintenance afterwards, you can do a lot of harm if you're not dilating and so on. So like, same thing, like me as a provider, I definitely love to hear that from our patients. And on that note, like relative to my patients, one thing folks oftentimes ask me, and I have my advice about it, but surgery for some folks, whether they like it or not, is going to be necessary as part of their transition, and so for some folks, like, these are, scary surgeries, and and oftentimes like long surgeries and a decent amount of recovery. And there is a lot of fear and anxiety that goes with that, especially if it's your first surgery. So any tips for patients who have a surgery coming up that they're very anxious about, how to manage that anxiety?
Yeah, I think that, look, surgeries are scary for all of us, regardless of the surgery, right? Because it is a big deal for anybody. And I know that for some people for whom the surgical process is going to be necessary, there's that, additional fear as well, too. I say, it's all going to come down to how well you know your surgical team, Have you talked to your doctor and had all of your questions answered? Because you have to trust your surgeon. And in fact, what you mentioned earlier, I advise for people, and anybody watching this right now, don't wait until you feel like you're ready for surgery. If you actually think that any type of gender affirming surgery is going to be in the future for you, even if you're contemplating it, consult today. First of all, consult with great doctors like yourself. They're not booked overnight. You're probably booking like months in advance. I know everybody who's great, they're not like immediately accessible. You're going to need that information because you're going to need to hear from doctor based on your body type, what's going to work for you, and most importantly, what do you need to do to prepare for this type of surgery, right? So it's that type of starting conversation to ease anxiety. And two, support system. Who's your support? And sometimes people say, I have nobody, and that's not true. If anybody watches my content, you have support.
Yeah.
If you so many great Facebook groups that are close, that are private, that are incredible, that's support, right? Anybody watching your content, which I know you produce a lot of, that's support. Any allies out there that create kind of a pro gender affirming content, that's support, whether you realize it or not. So lean on your support, and also know that many people went through the surgery and they were fine and everything turned out fine. Some element of anxiety is going to be natural and normal. Take a deep breath, you're going to be fine.
Yeah, absolutely. My advice is pretty much the same, basically like demystify the process. Thankfully now there is initially when I came into this field, the information available online was all over the place, but we're seeing a lot more reliable sources out there. And so, try to demystify it as much as possible. There are no such thing as it's no such thing as a dumb question for your surgeon. All of us would much rather you be fully informed and aware of what you're signing up for than not answer your question.
Yeah, sorry to jump into demystifying. The question that I hear is the most common, that is so completely inaccurate, and I'm sure that you're going to affirm it, is that vaginoplasty is the most complicated surgery with the most complication risks, which based on the research I've done, it is not. It's not the most complicated surgery with the most complicated risk. I mean, phalloplasty would be definitely trumps, in my opinion, vaginoplasty. Yeah. But it's this, sometimes people just think it's so much more terrifying. And I'm not saying that it's not a big surgical process, but it's also, there's a lot of misinformation, of misinformation on the internet.
There's a ton of fear mongering too, unfortunately, which we do see, which there may be different motives behind that. And one thing I just want to emphasize as well, which you touched on briefly earlier, is specialization. Particularly I find it so useful when it comes to mental health in this field, because not only you're not going to waste your time and years of kind of endless therapy, your time and your money, because transition is an expensive process, but if you go to a specialist from a very practical point of view, we're still in a world where we need letters, the gatekeeping is there if we want to go through insurance, that sort of thing. And there is a huge difference between a letter which is written by somebody who's a specialist and somebody who's not, so oftentimes the best thing to do when considering the mental health part of this, in my opinion, is to see who the specialist is, because like you, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but you are licensed in Oh, can you still see me?
Oh, fine.
Yeah.
You're just telling us what.
Yeah, there we go. So you're licensed in California, Florida, New York, and Texas. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah. So, from that point of view, you're available to patients in different states. And, really in this day and age, we do a lot of telehealth, and that's so useful, that folks don't have to, physically go and see people in person.
Yeah, I think, the letters we're now down to what this new W pass down to 1 letter versus 2, but insurances will know have their own criteria. They don't care a lot of times for W pass. Letters are funky, because I also tell people that at some point, I think, in my opinion, the providing community, such as being yourself, in my opinion, we also need to acknowledge that adults, and I've worked with adults, have to have autonomy over their body and decision making. And if you deciding that you want to go through gender affirming surgical process, that should be, I feel like, more on your side, making the decision for you, right? And I think that the team should help you whether you're set up properly in order to go through this process as best as you can. So when it comes to letters, you know, it's one of those gatekeeping processes people argue is necessary, some people argue it's not. I just wish we would give people more autonomy over their decision making, but you know, they are necessary. And yeah.
Yeah, necessary evil. Well, I think we're running out of time, but it was fantastic talking to you. Thank you so much. This is a wonderful resource. Where can folks get your book?
It's on Amazon, the easiest platform, Amazon, and you can get it in any format you want. So it's very, very easily accessible to people. And anybody watching, if they can't afford book, email me, go to my website, get my email me. I'm very happy to send free PDF file of the book. Very happy. I don't want people to not be able to have access to this. So.
And it is a wonderful resource. Well, thank you again so much, and we'll be in touch. All right.
Thank you so much.